Hi, welcome back. In this video, I want to show you how to draw this hyper-realistic wet hair portrait using graphite pencils. So let's get started. As always, these are the art supplies I'm going to use for this drawing, and you can pause the video right here to note them down. I'm using this 250 GSM paper from my ordinary smooth surface sketchbook, which is available in almost all the art stores or stationeries around the world. So you don't have to use any fancy paper for this specific drawing. And the drawing portion area is 8 x 10 inches. I drew the outline using grid method, and you can find the detailed step-by-step process from making the grid to outlining on my Patreon profile. Link is in the description. Okay, so let's start the most interesting part of the drawing, and that is the detailing process. And first of all, I'm darkening some of the strokes till the eyes portion so that they don't disappear in the future shading and blending process. When all the required strokes of the outline are done, let's add the base layer using a pea graphite powder. I'm adding this layer in circular scribbling motions with a bigger size dry brush to achieve a smooth base without any patches. Then to further blend this layer, I'm using a tissue paper and again moving my hand in circular motions to achieve smoothness. Now when the blending is done, it's time to layer the graphite onto the areas which need a little bit of depth. I'm dipping my bigger size dry brush into a pea graphite powder and carefully shading the right and left side of the nose respectively. This shadow will give a proper shape to the nose while creating a 3D base for future layers. I'm also layering the graphite onto the eyes or where required. Okay, so before moving further, I'm adding a background at the right top side using an 8B graphite pencil. I'm filling this small portion with pitch black shade to match it with the reference image. Coming back to the face portion, and some of the directional lines of the hair strands faded away during the shading process. So I'm darkening them using an 8B pencil to keep track of them without any hassle in the future layers. The base is still looking a bit unblended, so I'm going over the whole area again using a tissue paper. Okay, so coming back to the hair strands, and I'm carefully darkening them using an 8B pencil. Notice that I'm only going over the thicker hair strands which are darker in the reference image and leaving the thinner ones as they are. These lighter and darker strokes will help in creating the illusion of depth by showing the distance between them. Moving on to the eye, and I'm firstly darkening the upper eyelid to create the required thickness. I'm using the same 8B pencil but with a higher pressure and low angle to avoid any harsh strokes or lines. Before defining the outline of the iris, I'm also adding a very light base layer in this sclera by maintaining the pressure very low on my pencil. Now it's time to define the outline of the iris, and I'm using pressure technique for this purpose. I'm keeping the higher pressure at the edges of the iris to add a darker outline, and then gradually reducing it as I move towards the center of the iris, creating a perfect gradient, just like this. I'm also shading the eyelid portion using the same 8B pencil but with a variable pressure. This will create the required 3D base, which is perfect for future detailing process. I'm using a small blending stump for targeted blending of some of the darker areas to create a smooth transition of it with a lighter base. Notice that I'm also adding the shadow of a hair cluster in between the shading process, and it will make it appear slightly above the lid, giving it a perfect 3D look. And by the way, you can get access to our premium content and support this channel through Patreon. You can sign up through different membership levels and get access to all the outlines and grid references, etc. We have an ever-growing library of hundreds of exclusive and real-time tutorials, and you will also get access to 4 new tutorials every month. You can post your artworks in our active community of patrons and participate in our weekly critique sessions where I give my honest and positive critiques on your artworks, so you can improve your skills and get better with your drawing. Visit the link in description and become a premium member today. And a huge shout out to these incredible individuals who backed our channel on Patreon last month. Their generous support enabled me to produce this free tutorial for all of you guys. Okay, so when the darker base in the whole area is done, it's time to blend everything together, and I'm using a tissue paper. I have folded it into a round shape and now going over the whole area, and it will effectively give the area a smoother finish. I'm repeating the similar process of shading and blending the left eye, just like the way I did for the right one. When that base on both the eyes is done, it's time to start the detailing process, and I'm firstly adding eyebrow hair. I'm adding slightly curved and thin strokes very carefully to mimic such an effect. Make sure to keep the length of the strokes and distance between them variable to get a more natural look, as too much uniformity makes the eyebrows look flat and unrealistic. Also notice that I'm applying higher pressure for darker and thicker strokes and then reducing it for the lighter and thinner ones. In this way, we will get hair strokes of different thickness and will all together create a perfect 3D texture. The eyebrows are becoming thin as we move towards the end, so I'm adding these strokes accordingly. Keep on relating to the reference image to make sure you are on the right track. Now here comes the most interesting and satisfying part, that is the highlighting process. And firstly, let's prepare our electric eraser, and after adding the refill, I'm sharpening it by rubbing it on a sandpaper to achieve a thin, sharp tip. Now after carefully analyzing the reference image, I'm adding these small dots and strokes, keeping the size and distance variable. Notice that I'm applying higher pressure where I need brighter highlights and then reducing it for the softer ones, just like this. Some of the highlights are looking a bit sharp and bright, so to tone them down, I'm using my kneaded eraser and dabbing it onto the required areas. I'm also adjusting some darker details using my 8B pencil with a very light pressure, along with adding some new strokes where required. Add these intricate highlights all over the forehead portion, but make sure to keep on relating to the reference image. I always suggest that you guys keep the reference image in front of you in either soft or a hard form, as this makes the process a lot easier and quicker. When the lighter texture is done, I'm adjusting highlights by adding darker strokes right beside a few of them. This will make the highlights look more defined and separate from each other, along with adding the required depth. Okay, so now to make the eyebrows shiny and 3D, it's time to add the required highlights to match it with the reference image. And I'm adding dots, some in clusters and some individually, using sharp tip electric eraser. And these small highlights will bring the whole look of the drawing all together. The highlights on the hair strand is looking a bit wider, so to make it more crisp and thin, I'm using an 8B pencil and going along it. Okay, so now it's time to give the eyelid a glossy look, and for that the drill is same as we did for the forehead portion. I'm adding a mixture of bigger and smaller dots by keeping the pressure on my eraser variable. Variable pressure will help you in getting brighter and softer highlights and make the overall area look more 3D instead of single tone. Also notice that I'm adding some individual dots and some in clusters to mimic the glossy texture, just like the reference image. As the highlights on this left side is done, I'm extending the hair strands and adding some new ones to give the area a more natural look. Now I'm going over some of the highlights with a sharp tip electric eraser to make them pop up even more. Moving on to the right eye, and I'm repeating the similar shading and highlighting process as I did for the left one. Keep on relating to the reference image to make sure you are on the right track and add details accordingly. Moving on to the cheeks and nose portion, and I'm firstly darkening the hair clusters so that they don't fade away during the background shading and blending process. And then I'm also shading the left side of the nose with an 8B pencil using my favorite pressure technique. I'm also applying higher pressure at the center and then reducing it as I move towards the edges to create a smooth gradient. For the nostrils, I'm applying higher pressure to achieve a pitch black shade, just like the reference image. Keep on darkening the required areas and hair strands until you are fully satisfied with the final results. And now it's time to add a base layer using a big graphite powder. I'm going over both the cheeks and nose portion with a bigger sized draw brush. I'm carefully layering the graphite onto the areas where I need darker base and blending the whole portion using a circular scribbling motion. This will help us in getting a smooth 3D base. Now I'm shifting towards my medium-sized dry brush to effectively shade the smaller areas and to avoid excessive spilling of graphite onto the others. When the base layer is done, it's time to add the required shadows. And I'm firstly darkening the left side of the nose by keeping the angle on my pencil very low. And that's how we will have a layer without any harsh lines or strokes. Now to make the hair strands appear 3D, it's very important to incorporate their shadows onto the face. And after carefully analyzing the reference image, I'm adding these shadows keeping the pressure variable. I'm also maintaining the angle very low to avoid any harsh lines or strokes. By using the same 8B pencil, I'm adding some textural dots onto the cheeks near the nose to mimic the freckles. I'm also adjusting the shadows and layering graphite over the required areas until I achieve the required darkness. Now it's time to blend this layer and I'm using my bigger size blending stump. I'm using the pointy tip of the blending stump for targeted blending of the shadows and texture. And to give some of the areas a more smooth and fine look, I'm going over them with a medium-sized dry brush. Make sure not to overblend this layer as it will make the texture dull and too smooth. I'm going back and forth with my tools to achieve the required depth on the hair strands or where required. Okay, so when we look at the nose, we can see that some contours are still missing. So I'm layering graphite using an 8B pencil. Once the first layer of shadows is done, it's time to blend it using a medium-sized dry brush. Some of the areas are still looking unblended, so I'm using my blending stump for targeted blending of these areas. I'm using the clean side for the areas where I need to pick up the excessive graphite and then switching the side using the dirty one to shade the areas along with blending them. This small technique will help you in getting the required dark and light base in less time. To make the tip of the nose even more smooth and blended, I'm using a smooth tissue paper and going over it very carefully. Make sure to only blend the tip of the nose as we only want smoothness in this specific area. Some of the shadows are still looking dull, so I'm going back and forth with my tools until I achieve the required results. Okay, so now let's make the nose 3D, and as we can see in the reference image that the nose has some subtle highlights. So I'm using my perfection eraser and adding these softer highlights on this left nostril. I'm applying higher pressure at the center and then reducing it as we move away from it. In this way, we will get a smooth highlight which is brighter from the center and subtle from the edges. Okay, so for the tip, I'm firstly picking up the excessive graphite by keeping the pressure very low on the eraser. And then to make it a bit more prominent, I'm dabbing my knead eraser onto the tip and nose bridge. This will give us the right amount of highlights with a bit of texture, just like the way we need it here. I'm also lightening the inner corner of the right eye using a perfection eraser, and it will immediately make it look popped up and 3D. Okay, so moving on to the right cheek, and I'm repeating the similar process of adding the shadows under the hair cluster to make them look more natural. I'm also shading the areas which are looking a bit dull to add the required depth, just like the way I did for the right cheek. You can also use a small blending stump for the targeted blending of the shadow, and it will give them a more subtle and blurry look, just like the reference image. When you're done with the base of darker texture, now it's time to add the required highlights. And for this, I'm using my electric eraser to add a mixture of small strokes and dots. Notice that I'm focusing on the areas which are shiny and a bit higher than the rest of the portions to create a 3D glossy effect. For some areas of the eye, I'm switching towards the perfection eraser in between to create the perfect blend of soft and bright highlights. Moving on to the cheeks, and before diving into the highlighting process, I'm firstly lightening some of the excessive graphite by tapping my kneaded eraser over the required areas. It will pick up the excessive graphite and create a very subtle skin texture in very less time. And then adding a mixture of bigger and smaller dots to create shiny pores and wet hair respectively. When the brighter dots are done, it's time to add some subtle ones in between the brighter ones. And I'm using my sharp tip perfection eraser for this purpose. I'm going back and forth with my tools to add final touches to the skin texture on the left side of the face. Okay, let's move on to the nose, and first of all I'm using my mono zero eraser and adding soft dots and highlights on the tip. Notice that I'm applying variable pressure to create the required texture. When the first layer is done, it's time to add a second layer of highlights in between and around the previous ones. And it will make them look brighter from the center and softer from the edges. And to add a thin and delicate texture, I'm using my sharp tip electric eraser and adding these tiny dots on the tip of the nose. Now let's add life to the right eye, and firstly I'm picking some excess graphite from the sclera using a perfection eraser. To make it more prominent, I'm adding another layer over it by using a sharp tip electric eraser. The eye has some white shiny hair, so I'm adding these strokes to mimic such texture using my flat tip mono zero eraser. As always, I've pasted a small piece of wider masking tape to the chart paper, and now I'm scraping my eraser on it, which is effectively cleaning the tape without wasting much of the refill. You can also use a scraper or any other rough surface for this purpose. I'm also adding curved strokes over the darker hair to make them look more shiny and wet. Some of the darker details faded away, so I'm adjusting them using my 8B pencil with a very light pressure. Okay, so now let's make the iris shiny, and the drill is same as we usually do. I'm firstly adding some softer highlights using a perfection eraser, and when the base of highlights is done, it's time to make them pop up even more by adding another layer of highlights over the previous one using my mono zero eraser. This will make the highlights softer from the edges and brighter from the center. And this difference in tones and shades makes the overall drawing more detailed and realistic. Okay, so now again it's time to add dots of variable sizes using an electric eraser, just like the way we did for the left portion of the face. And it will start to make the cheek look more shiny and wet in no time. Make sure to take your time and add these intricate dots in between the hair strokes very carefully so that you can achieve desired results. Notice that I'm using the same electric eraser but without turning it on to add this softer texture. In this way, it will work as mono zero eraser and add a bit of subtle and softer highlights. Okay, so when the brighter texture is done, it's time to add the softer strokes for the skin texture. And I'm using my perfection eraser for this purpose. I'm adding these slant strokes all over the cheeks portion to mimic skin texture and freckles. But make sure to use a sharp tip and keep the pressure on your eraser very low, as we want very subtle yet fine texture in this area. As we move towards the nose portion, I'm erasing a small circular motions instead of adding slant strokes, as the texture here is more blended and blurry. And that is how we have created a realistic texture effortlessly. Okay, so moving on to the lower portion of the face, and I'm repeating the similar process as I did for the upper portion. I'm firstly darkening all the directional lines and strokes using an 8B pencil so that I can keep track of them during future layers. Also notice that I'm adding a base layer in between the darkening process of the directional lines. I'm using my favorite pressure technique to create a 3D base. You can also use a lighter grade pencil like 3B to shade lighter areas and then switch towards the darker ones to achieve darker tones. But I would highly suggest you to practice pressure technique as it will save a lot of time and energy. Now to embed the graphite into its place, I'm adding a layer of 2H pencil over the required portions. It will add slight depth to the area along with reducing the patchiness of the previous graphite layer by filling in the empty spots. I call this technique a graphite locking method, and it is used almost all the time whenever a pressure technique is used. Now it's time to blend everything together, and I'm firstly using a medium-sized toy brush. And then to make it even more smooth, I will use tissue paper later on. Okay, so as always, I'm now adding a subtle skin texture by dabbing my kneaded eraser over the required portions. Knead your eraser in a small round tip and dab it over the areas. It will pick up the excessive graphite, creating a texture which is bright from the center and blended from the edges. But make sure to knead it more frequently to increase its effectiveness. I'm also blending the upper edge of the lip using a blending stump to give it a more blended and soft look, just like the reference image. Some of the darker tones and shadows are still looking dull, so I'm adjusting the whole lower face portion and adding another layer over the required portions using my 8B pencil. This hair cluster on the right side has some shadows, so before adding them in this very small space, I'm adding the required small dots using an electric eraser, and then adding the required shadows of hair on the skin using an 8B pencil, just like this. The upper lip portion is still looking a bit dark and flat to me, so I'm highlighting the right nostril using a perfection eraser. The nostril has a few brighter highlights as well, so I'm going over the previous ones using a mono 0 eraser. It will immediately make the area look more 3D and realistic. I'm again switching towards my perfection eraser and adding these subtle highlights on the cupid bow portion. Okay, so now the base is done, it's time to add the brighter highlights, and I'm using my mono 0 eraser for this purpose. I'm adding small dots of random sizes by keeping the pressure variable on it. This will help us in achieving darker and lighter tones, which is essential in realistic and hyper-realistic drawings, because single tone details make the drawing look flat and unrealistic. To make this area more shiny and 3D, I'm using my sharp tip electric eraser and adding some dots in between and over the previous ones. I'm repeating the similar process for the rest of the upper portion. Moving on to the lips, and the texturing process here is also very simple. I'm using the same electric eraser with a sharp tip and adding these small dots and strokes very carefully. Keep relating to the reference image in between while adding these intricate details to make sure you are on the right track. Okay, so the process is pretty much same as we did previously, and I'm using the same technique I've discussed earlier to add texture on the jaw and chin portion. I'm also detailing the teeth, and for that, I'm firstly using a clean blending stump to blend the base layer over them to get a smooth canvas, and then using a 2H pencil to add a light layer over them. This will fill in the empty spots effectively as I discussed earlier. Now let's add life to them, and I'm firstly using a perfection eraser and picking up the graphite from the lower portion of the teeth. The perfection eraser is ideal to create soft and subtle highlights and texture. When the softer base of highlights is done, I'm topping the teeth with brighter highlights using an electric eraser very carefully. I'm also using the same electric eraser but without turning it on to add softer ones. You can also use a mono 0 eraser for this purpose. I'm repeating the similar process for the rest of the teeth as well. And in the end, you can use your mono 0 eraser or electric eraser and top up the whole drawing with these thin dots as required. And with this last step, we are done with this realistic wet hair portrait drawing. Creating these free tutorials needs a significant amount of time and energy. So if you found this valuable, please show your support by liking the video. Your support keeps me inspired to bring you more creative content. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.